Welcome back to Unleashed with Mark Morano on TNT. All right. Joining the program, my old friend Hans Labohm, who studied economics, University of Amsterdam. He's been a longtime fighter by my side back when I worked in the United States Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. He's been fighting the battle of climate hysteria in Europe, fighting the battle for energy rational policy. And his new book just came out in actually 2024. I guess it was first available for sale in December 2023, late December. It's called The Chronicles of Climate Hysteria, special collection of book, Hans Labohm, Dick Thiones, and Jeroen Hetzler. Welcome to the program, Hans.
Wow, it's fine to have you.
Great.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you fine. Thank you.
Okay.
So talk to me now. First of all, give us a little your background. Who is Hans Labohm? Tell us. You studied economics. You grew up in Europe. You're still in Europe. How did you ever get involved in the climate battle? What was your life like before you started fighting climate hysteria?
Well, I was at that time lecturing at the Netherlands Institute for International Relations. That is an institute which is comparable to several think tanks in Europe and in the United States. I was lecturing international economics there, and I was, amongst other things, comparing economic systems. That is to say, the central planning economy and the Rhineland model and the free market model as it exists in the UK and in the United States. And I was comparing the features of those models with the performance. And at that time, it struck me that our system, that is to say, the free market system, was superior as regards freedom and as regards economic performance. And I saw that there was a difference with the central planning economy, which was characterized by more regulation. Then the climate scare came up. And I was afraid, I saw at that time, that's more than 20 years ago, that it would imply a new layer of regulations and thus a negative impact on the wealth creating capacity of our economic system. So I was very critical about that. And then, of course, there was a beginning of the climate scare or climate propaganda, but it was only a very small minority of people who are propagating, are promoting that idea. But I was at that time very critical. And then I started to publish articles on the issue in, of course, the Netherlands, but also in Germany and the UK, and also in the United States. Tech Central Station was a website on which I published many postings. And I became very critical of that. And I also associated myself with organizations which you know well, for instance, the Heartland Institute, yeah, which I think did a tremendous job in fighting this, what I call really a serious case of collective folly.
Wow. So you're looking at this, you're looking at economics. Tell us about, go back to what you said earlier about the results. You were studying central planning essentially versus free market economies. Until the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, there were many people touting the virtues of that central planning, sort of for resource allocation. But you know the truth, you looked at it. And now we sort of today have many people touting the virtues of sort of the Chinese social credit system, the Chinese model of one-party rule. You don't have the messiness of democracy. So let's go back to just, first of all, your study. What did you find with the results of that central planning versus freer markets?
Well, the central planning system at that time and still is actually not performing so well in terms of the wealth creating capacity of a social system. And then, of course, there is this issue of personal freedom. And the personal freedom is very limited, as we all know, in those systems. And what we have seen is that there is a strong correlation between freedom on the one hand and economic performance on the other hand. And both from a theoretical point of view and from a practical empirical point of view, you see that our system is working very well compared with the other systems. However, with the introduction of the climate scare, as I would call it, we have now the risk of introducing a new layer of rules and regulation on top of the existing layers of rules and regulations which we already have in our system. And the experience shows that this regulation is very negative in terms of economic performance, in the sense that a major part of the sluggishness of our economic performance today should be attributed to these layers of rules and regulations.
So in other words, we were essentially once a free market, Europe, the United States, the Western world. And then the climate scare comes along, and instead of trying to say it sort of like a Marxist selling it, this is for the people, and this is to stick it to the bourgeois, the idea of attractive ideology. They're saying we have no choice but to do these central planning regulations because the climate crisis demands it. So let me flip this around real quick. Is it possible that if we actually did face a climate crisis, let's assume they were right, wouldn't the last thing we'd want to do is centrally plan? Because it seems like that would be a way of stifling human innovation, stifling prosperity, which would give us cleaner environments, give us technology that would reduce our emissions, et cetera. But don't you think they have it backwards? Even if they were right, pushing this climate scare and the science, we'll just set that aside a minute. Wouldn't central planning be the exact wrong way to go about it, and limits on freedom in order to fight a climate crisis if one existed?
Yes, I think you are right. First of all, a climate crisis does not exist.
Yes.
It is an illusion, and it is not true. As a matter of fact, the so-called AGW hypothesis, that is to say, anthropogenic global warming or man-made global warming hypothesis, has never been proved scientifically. And if one looks at the science, climatology as science, then one sees that there is a certain movement over the last few years, in the sense that nobody today believes that the models, the so-called climate models, which is a mixture of economic models and climate models, which gives certain scenarios, which are scary if you look at the scenarios which are presented by the so-called IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. These scary scenarios are running all too hot. That is to say that there is actually no climate emergency or climate crisis. That should be borne in mind, first of all.
Yes.
Secondly, there is also a movement in the climatological literature which tells us that all these estimates of so-called climate sensitivity, that is the impact of a doubling of the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere will have on global temperatures. The estimates have gone down dramatically over the last few years. The estimates in the peer-reviewed literature, and both the protagonists and the antagonists of climate change agree that these estimates, these previous estimates were false and were exaggerated. Then what you also see in the literature is an acknowledgement of a certain saturation effect of CO2. CO2 has, uh, according to most scientists on both sides of the divide, according to most scientists, a certain modest impact, and as far as the alarmists are concerned, a very strong impact on temperatures. But what we see is that the estimates are going down and that there is more acknowledgement of a saturation effect. If you paint a glass black, and you do it one time, then there will be only a very small amount of light coming through. If you do it two times, then the amount of light will be negligible. Now, and then another very important development also in the literature is that there is actually a reappraisal of the role of CO2. Instead of regard it as a sort of bogeyman, it is seen as an elixir of life, as a building block of life, because it's plant food. It's good for the production of agriculture, and it is also very good for mankind and for nature.
Yes. And so how did they so successfully, like you're in Europe, I know in places like UK, it's hard to find even any elected officials willing to challenge the narrative of climate change like you just did. How did they get so powerful? I mean, we thought with the fall of the Soviet Union, the central planners were in the dustbin of history. There was a lot of hysteria. I shouldn't say hysteria. There was a lot of hopeful times and people saying, this is the end of central planning. It's been exposed as the death knell of human civilization. We'll never go back to it. But yet within, say, 15 years of the fall of the Soviet Union, here we are again. We're talking about net zero goals and sectors under net zero. The energy sector has to be regulated, micromanaged. The agricultural sector, high yield agriculture, fertilizer, they have to go after animal agriculture, transportation, bans on gas powered cars. We're taking a page, Hans, from East Germany, where they said you could only have one government-approved car, the crappy East German Trabant. And here you have Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, saying you can only have one car, the EV, the impractical, expensive, China-laden EV. How in the hell did this happen to the world? We didn't learn any lessons from the fall of the Soviet Union, and we jumped right back in to a new form of central planning.
Yeah, that's true. Well, the point is, of course, that not many people know what the central planning system was. And these memories have been fading away in our collective memory. But I think that indeed the climate scare is used as a kind of alibi or pretext in introducing elements of central planning, elements of, also loss of freedom in our economic system. When I was a young diplomat, I was posted at NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. My first professional job was actually to be a member of the permanent representation of the Netherlands at NATO headquarters in Brussels. And with that background, I could never imagine that this would happen, that we ourselves would introduce elements of central planning. Now, how did this come about? Well, first of all, I think that science discovered that there was a link between the CO2 concentration and temperatures, so-called Vostok ice core. That was an ice core on the South Pole, which showed that temperatures and CO2 concentrations went up, actually in tandem. But actually, the scales on which the graph was shown was a little bit coarse. And so people thought that CO2 would increase temperatures, but it was actually the other way around. So that was really a failure. That was, and because of the progress of science, normal progress of science, it was discovered that the original assumption was wrong. Nevertheless, it was never widely published in the papers at that time. And it is actually also a little bit forgotten. Now, so science was in the first phase actually on a track which was wrong, and it was only later recognized. But one strange way, the scientists were trapped because in the meantime, also politics had taken over, and politics had taken the driver's seat in this very issue. And many politicians, which were not first in science, took the wrong track. And this has been accepted. There's been a kind of way in the international institution. It has been accepted by many people. And the left, of course, saw in this climate scare an instrument to introduce more state intervention in the Western economies, which they would have liked all along. So all these elements together converged and led to the present situation in which we are actually in a serious case, as I told you before, of collective folly.
Wow. Okay, we're talking with economist Hans Labohm, the co-author of The Chronicles of Climate Hysteria, brand new book. We have to take a break, Hans. We'll be right back. This is Unleashed with Mark Morano on TNT. Stay tuned for more.
Anticipate potential delays for the morning commute. In other news, a recent government report on prescription drug pricing points to corporate
Freedom of the press is about your right to know.
What are you talking about, man? Look at his stats.
It's about your right to be informed. Your right to access all types of information keeps us free as a nation.
No.
Today, there are real threats to press freedom.
Residential areas by...
And your right to know about the world around us.
Look.
Some threats are obvious, some are easy to miss, but they all put our way of life at risk. We must defend against all of these threats, no matter what kind of news is important to you.
Justified putting American troops in harm's way?
That's a great question.
We must protect our right to know before it's too late. Understand the threats. ProtectPressFreedom.org.
I'm Belinda, and this is Willard, and we were adopted in 2021. When we first met Todd, he was singing a song, and I was like, wow, look at this kid with the biggest smile, and he has a big heart to match.
The energy you give Todd, you get it back from Todd.
Yeah.
Todd's a joy.
Yes,
Todd
he is.
really is a great joy.
I love him. You and you.
Learn about adopting a teen from foster care. You can't imagine the reward. Visit adoptuskids.org.
Fearless, informative, and unfettered. Mark Morano is Unleashed on today's News Talk, TNT Radio.
Welcome back to Unleashed with Mark Morano on TNT. We're talking with economist, climate researcher Hans Labohm, co-author of the book Chronicles of Climate Hysteria, brand new 2024 book. All right, here's a question for you. Part of this climate hysteria is the suppression of free speech, of independent thought. What have you and your colleagues in Europe experienced by not signing on to the climate hysteria narrative? Have you been bullied, silenced, censored, canceled? Have colleagues of yours been? Is there room for open debate in academia and in the European media on this subject?
Now, the majority of the mainstream media think that everything which deviates from the official narrative of climate crisis should be boycotted. And that is to say that we have enormous difficulty in publishing our articles, in disseminating our thoughts. I started some 20 years ago, and at that time there was still room for me on Dutch television. And then I stated once that I thought that this climate scare was a serious case of collective insanity. Now, the next day, I had a frank conversation with the director of the institute where I was working, and we were very good friends, and we are still good friends. But he was in an impossible situation, and he requested me that I should refrain from such remarks. Now, I felt not free at that time anymore, and I was very fond of a free academic atmosphere. So at that time, immediately, I felt obliged to offer my resignation. And he was flabbergasted when I did so, on the spur of the moment. No, we said goodbye to each other, and we departed as good friends. But that is a personal experience which I personally had, and which colleagues of mine of the circle of climate skeptics or climate realists have also. We have tried to get in touch with people from the Royal Met in the Netherlands. And those attempts all failed. And at the moment, we still have a standing invitation. We still want to speak with them and to discuss with them, but they refuse to do so. And that also applies to the majority of the mainstream media in the Netherlands, especially also on television. That is really one propaganda club for the climate scare.
How do they capture academia, the media, with this thought? How does that happen? How did it happen in the Netherlands and in Europe?
Well, I don't know exactly, but it is a matter of faith. It is a new cult. It is a new religion. And I have the impression that it is really something which has more to do with emotions than with rational thinking. I think that also the lack and the loss of religion in Europe is part of the problem, and that there is a kind of vacuum which should be filled, and it is Mother Earth, it is Gaia, who took the place of Jesus Christ, and this is perhaps a little bit exaggerated, but that's the way how I feel about it.
Now, you have in Europe now, as I mentioned earlier, you have the rationing of energy, the rationing of food. They're going after farmers, the rationing of your freedom of movement, 15-minute cities, the gas-powered car bans. Do you think the European public, the Western public, is going to continue to take this? I mean, up until now, it's been a lot of rhetoric. There's been hidden cost increases. But if they're actually coming now for meat eating, for gas-powered cars, we have CNN calling about carbon passports to limit your travel. You have the German transport minister last week float the idea of weekend car bans for driving in Germany in order for them to meet their climate goals, which is the ultimate of sort of Stalin's 5-year plan and central planning. Do you think the public will tolerate this, or do you expect a blowback and a collapse of this agenda?
Well, what we see today in Europe is a movement to the right, to political support for growing support for political parties which are right of the center. And of course, the mainstream media are always portraying those parties as a radical right or populist right, which is of course pejorative, and it means that they take a stance and they are not neutral anymore. But there is a very strong tendency towards the right, and those parties, all those parties, are very critical of climate policies. So I expect that there will be a very important movement to the right in the next elections for the European Parliament, which may, and I hope so, but perhaps it's whistling in the dark, I hope so, stop the ludicrous policies which are now in the offing as far as climate policies are concerned.
Now you were in academia, university. We have today this rise of the youth climate movement, where you have kids in the United States as young as 8, kids in Europe, elementary school, high school, suing the EU, suing European governments, suing the US government for failing to ensure their climate future. We have the rise of people like Greta Thunberg as the spokesman, whose phrase was, "I want you to panic. I want you to be afraid." What have they done with children, and can kids be unindoctrinated? How do we deprogram the kids to think, to not believe in this apocalyptic future for themselves?
Yeah, that is indeed a very important question, but unfortunately, I do not have any answer to it. It is indeed so. Yeah, it is indeed so that there is a strong tendency of indoctrination of little kids and to indoctrinate them, to brainwash them with climate fear. And also there are psychiatrists who are dealing with the anguishes and the fears which these kids are suffering from. So it is indeed an important problem. Nevertheless, I think that there are also counter tendencies. If you take the opinion polls over the last few years, you see a decline in climate fears among grown-ups. A couple of years ago, climate change or global warming, as it was called at that time, but there is no global warming, so they had to rename it in climate change. Climate change was seen as a very important issue. And now there is really a very astonishing decline in the outcome of the opinion polls, which tells us that now only 20% or so of the population, instead of 60 or 70 or 80% of the population, see this as a priority problem.
All right. Well, you wrote this book, The Climate Chronicles, The Climate Chronicles of Climate Hysteria. How do we get out of this? What do you think? What's the next step? I mean, how does this end? Does this end? The forces of central planning seem to always recycle themselves. They'll come back. But how do we end this climate hysteria and the energy, food, and transportation policies that they're leading to? What's our path forward? What do you think, having studied this issue for decades?
Now, I think that we should go on with giving reliable information, facts, and so on. If you are publishing the facts on climate change and the rise in temperature, and you explain what the causes are, then of course you have something which may convince more and more people. And there are indications that more and more grown-up people and people who have common sense are convinced that the exaggerations of the past are indeed not good. So we should disseminate reliable information, scientific information. We should expose the facts. That's one thing. The second very important point is that when it hits the wallets, the money which people have to spend on all these things. And when it leads to impoverishment, as it does now, then I think that people may become more aware and may become more conscious of what is really happening. So I think that also explains the turn to the right in the European political arena, and that it will also continue. And then, of course, the third important point is the fact that other countries, countries who are emitting more CO2 than both the United States and Europe together, such as India and China, don't bother don't think that this is a serious problem. If you look at their policies, they promise, yes, the reduction of CO2, but they don't do it. And of course, rightly so. So I think that this mixture may give rise to a certain movement, a certain turn to more common sense than we have so far.
Let's hope you're right. All right, Hans Labohm, author of Chronicles of Climate Hysteria. Thank you for joining us today. We're out of time. We appreciate it. Good to see you, old friend.
My pleasure.
Thank you. All right, this is Unleashed with Mark Morano on TNT. We'll see you after the break.